My proudest achievement is the finishing of my PhD project basically. So it was realizing flexible silicon, or I would say bendable silicon, for the application in electronic skin. So as we know, like flexible electronics is getting paced nowadays, but if we see that processing units are mostly rigid, made up of rigid silicon because they are like 700 micrometer, and if we want to use those things in the flexible electronics, that makes our system a bit semi-flexible because one part is rigid, one is not. So my PhD project was to make it sure that silicon gets flexible. So I used some thinning methodologies to bring the thickness from 700 micrometer to 550 micrometer, and at that thickness the silicon becomes bendable. So what are the process requirements and how the bending or the thinning affects the device characteristic, because we don't just want to thin the device, we want to make sure that once it gets thin, it still performs under the margin of error. So that was my biggest achievement, to make sure to develop the process for the thinning methodologies. Personally, I will be joining in industry. So I am moving in a power semiconducting devices now because I have got the exposure of the flexible electronics, and as a fresh graduate, I want to diverse my field a bit. So that's why I'll be joining an industry called Dynex Semiconductors as a senior design engineer. So I would have liked physics and the various things happening in our world which has been affected by the engineering, and still there are so many unsolved problems which need our attention. The new problems as well as the resources which are available now, which were not available before to our past engineers. For them it was quite hard to think of any solution. Like, it was easy to think, but it was hard to implement. But in the current scenario, we have a plethora of resources which we can use and solve a bigger problem, or maybe imagine an unimaginable problem and solve it. So that's the biggest advantage of living in the current society. For students, they should be motivated because we need a continuous influx of the engineers with fresh mind, because problems keeps on changing. Problems are a function of time, as if we write it as a function. So that's why we need to make sure that the coming generation, like the incoming people, also do have a fresh mind as well as a new way of thinking. Finding an answer is important, but it's not the only thing. If you can simplify the questions or the problem for your junior or your next generation, that's also a contribution.